Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for the third in our series of charity webinars this year. The topic for this year is an introduction to the Charity Code of Governance. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Nick Murphy from Tilney Smith Williamson, who will appear on screen next to me. Oh, there he is, and we will just introduce ourselves. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Liz Brownsell, and I'm a partner and head of charities at Birketts. And Nick?
Hi, so I work for Tilney Smith Williamson. We're the fourth largest wealth manager in the UK, covering investment planning, investment management, and also we're a top 10 tax and accountancy firm. I'm a partner at Smith Williamson. I head up the institutional charity group, and we manage over 3 billion of assets across the UK and Ireland, and I live in East Anglia.
Thanks, Nick. Okay, so today our topic is the Charity Governance Code. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the code, it was developed by the sector for the sector, and it is endorsed by the Charity Commission. It is not legal or regulatory in nature, but what it does is it provides recommendations for best practice and sets out a number of principles for how to achieve the highest standards of governance within your charity. What you see on the screen here is a diagram form of the code showing how it's structured. And what we're going to do is take you through each of the sections of the code in turn. Our emphasis today is very much on recommended practice rather than the whys, rather than the rationale for each of the pillars. So what our aim is to take you through each of the pillars, giving you some of our top tips for how to implement it in practice and some of the pitfalls that we have seen through our own experience. We won't go through absolutely every aspect of the code, there isn't time for that. And what I would recommend you do is read through it for yourselves at your own leisure. It's not a long document and it's very easy to use. It is suitable for charities of all sizes and types, but there is a recognition that what is suitable for charities does vary depending on your size. And so the code has two separate versions, both available on the same website. There is a version for larger charities, and as a rule of thumb, that's about £1 million of annual income with external auditing of your accounts. And then there's a separate version of the code for smaller charities, and the principles are the same, but there are just some subtle differences in terms of recommended practice. Okay, so to begin with, there is the foundation principle, which you will see at the bottom there. Now, this is a set of assumptions upon which the code is built. So all this is saying we assume that as a charity trustee, you are committed to the purposes of your charity. You understand your role and responsibilities as a charity trustee. You also understand the requirement for an ongoing public benefit from your activities as an organisation, and you are committed to good governance. So those are the assumptions upon which the code is developed. And so what the code does not do is go into any detail about your role and responsibilities or the public benefit requirement, for example. Now, if you are uncertain or you would like a refresher or you're very new to the role of a charity trustee, please do consider joining us at one of our rolling programs of charity trustee induction and refresher training. It's currently delivered wholly virtually. We deliver it roughly 4 times per year. There's a session coming up next month. It is delivered at the moment in 2 chunks. So we have 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon, so you don't get too much screen fatigue from the online nature of the format. And we also include within that a section on employment. So there is a little bit in there for those of you who are trustees of a charity that has got employees. There's a section in there about your role as an employer. So that might be worth considering if you would like a little bit more help with these foundation principles. So with that assumption in mind, the top part of the code is the organisational purpose. It is what your charity is established for. It is the charitable purposes as set out in your governing document. Now, the point of putting this at the very top of that diagram is to demonstrate that all of the pillars of good governance are there to hold up and advance that organisational purpose. In other words, everything that you do should be designed to achieve and advance your charitable purposes. It's really fundamental to your duties and to good governance that your objectives are always tied back to that overarching purpose. So in terms of practical recommendations, how can you ensure this, and what does the code say? Well, key to organisational purpose is strategy and planning. Okay, you know what it is that your charity is established to do, but how are you going to achieve that? What is the most effective way to advance your charity's purposes? This isn't something that's static, it is something that changes with time. And what I would recommend is that you don't try to think about strategy in the general course of your board meetings. It can be very difficult to find time to adequately step back and reflect on the strategic direction of your organisation when you are dealing with the day-to-day business of running your charity as a board of trustees. So what is preferable is to have a separate meeting on strategy from time to time. It's not necessarily something you will do every year, but periodically, and in particular at the moment in the wake of the pandemic, lots of charities are holding strategic meetings and planning meetings to step back, take stock, and think about any changes that might need to be made. The sorts of things that you will need to consider are things to do with sustainability of the charity, changes in need of your beneficiary group if you have one, changes in social and economic circumstances, and all of the significant changes in the way that we're all living our lives now following the last 18 months and the restrictions that we've had. When you are carrying out this sort of strategic review, this guidance by the Charity Commission is extremely useful and I thoroughly recommend it. It's called 15 Questions Trustees Should Ask. There is a guidance document on the Charity Commission website that sets out in a bit more detail what they mean by each of the questions and how to use them. Not every question is relevant to every charity, and of course you can skip over those that are less relevant to you, but it just provides prompts on really bigger picture, strategic sorts of things that you should be looking at when you're considering the effectiveness of your charity and whether or not the way that you are operating is still appropriate for your strategic aims and objectives. To achieve strong leadership, you need to make sure that your board is effective. And we're going to talk a little later on about board effectiveness. But this pillar of governance, this is the first pillar in upholding that organisational purpose. Clearly, in order to achieve that strategic direction and to have that good process of planning, you need to ensure that your charity is headed by an effective board that provides that strategic leadership in line with your aims and values. What do we mean by this in practice? Well, leading by example is the message of the day. And actually, with the updated code from 2020 last year, it was updated. It is regularly updated. But the things that were really emphasized in the update recently were integrity and the equality, diversity, and inclusion principles, which we'll come on to. But leading by example feeds very much into those principles. It's about setting values and a culture for the organisation and demonstrating that through all of your behaviours, both in and outside of the boardroom. Remember, you are very much the face of the charity in many respects as its trustees, so your actions and your activities outside of the boardroom can have just as much of an impact on the culture of the organisation as your activities within the boardroom. So it's about having that collective responsibility, recognizing that you as a group are collectively responsible for the success of the charity, that you agree on a set of core values and the culture that you want to instill within the organization. What matters to you? What's your mission? What are the values that you want to see and the ethical principles that you want to employ in achieving your purposes? Part of this is about welcoming diverse views, and again, we'll talk about that in a little bit when we come on to board effectiveness and the equality, diversity, and inclusion principles. There's also quite a significant role in oversight and direction, which we will talk about when we come to decision-making, risk, and control. Listening to feedback is also critical. In order to be good leaders, you do need to listen to feedback from those who are interested, so stakeholders, members, beneficiaries, and staff. And critically, to lead a charity effectively, it is all about time and preparation. So as a board, you need to make sure that, for example, you are receiving board papers from your executive team, if you have one, in sufficient time to be able to adequately prepare to fully contribute to the board meetings that you are holding. In certain times, you might need to have more board meetings than usual, and you need to be prepared to step up as and when required. So part of being a good and effective leadership is about understanding the expectations of you as a charity trustee in the context of your charity. The next pillar is the pillar on integrity, and this is one of the ones that I mentioned has received more of an overhaul in the 2020 update. What's happened with this principle and what's changed is that it has moved away from just focusing on protecting the reputation of your charity and managing conflicts of interest to think more about broader principles. So, for example, ensuring and establishing the right values for your charity, applying ethical principles to decision making, addressing any undue power balances, and critically ensuring the right to be safe. So these emphases are slightly different to how the integrity principle was previously set out. And I think this is reflective of what we've seen within the sector and within society generally. You'll all be aware of some of the safeguarding scandals that we've seen over recent years, and this right to be safe and the role of charities in relation to that is now quite significant and very much on the regulator's radar. So for integrity and ensuring the right to be safe, the key things to remember here are that safeguarding and that notion of safeguarding goes beyond the traditional concepts of protecting children and vulnerable adults. Now, for some of you, you might be sat there thinking, well, my charity doesn't work with anybody who would be particularly vulnerable. How is safeguarding relevant? Well, the answer is that the Commission takes the view that all charities have a duty to safeguard everybody who comes into contact with that charity from harm. By way of example, you might have an employee. I know not all charities do. It could be a volunteer rather than an employee. But say, just using the example of an employee, you have somebody who makes an allegation of sexual harassment. Now that you might think, well, that's an HR issue if they're an employee, and we need to manage that in line with all of our HR policies and procedures. And yes, that's true. And you do need to comply with employment law. But you also need to think about safeguarding. What other steps might you need to take to safeguard this individual whilst the investigation is carried out? And that is not to predetermine the outcome of any investigation, but it is just to be sensible about putting measures in place to protect them from harm, given the allegations that they've made. You should also think about whether a sexual harassment allegation or something along those lines, or any other incident affecting the welfare, the well-being of somebody in contact with the charity constitutes a serious incident and should be reported to the Charity Commission. So safeguarding is a very broad topic and it covers absolutely everything within the charity. So in practical terms, when you're thinking about this, what you need to do is assess risk, essentially. Where are the risks? Where are the risks of harm within your organisation and your activities? And do we have adequate policies and procedures in place to address this? Now, it won't always be within a safeguarding policy. You will have HR policies for staff. You will have perhaps policies around volunteers and how you handle complaints and manage issues with volunteers. But what you want to make sure is that you have thought about it and put proper policies and procedures in place, and critically delivered any necessary training so that the relevant people within the organisation understand what is expected and what's important. The other thing with safeguarding and ensuring the right to be safe is that you keep it under regular review. Now, what that means for your charity very much depends on your activities and operations, but you should have, as is the case with all policies and procedures, a programme for regular review. Conflicts of interest should not be overlooked. They still remain an important part of the integrity principle. Now, I can't go into any detail about these today, but it is very critical that you understand what the legal position is on conflicts of interest and how it applies to you in your role as a trustee. If you feel that you need a refresher or some more training on this, please do join us for the 4th webinar this year, which will be all about managing conflicts of interest and dealing with issues of personal benefit. For today, all I can do is just touch on the fact that it is critical that you understand the rules. And that means understanding that conflicts of interest go beyond a financial benefit. They extend to conflicts of loyalty, as that term is used by the Commission. And this can include, for example, where you have personal views or opinions that inhibit your ability to act independently in the best interests of the charity. So it's really key that you understand what we mean when we talk about conflicts of interest, what the Charity Commission considers is a conflict of interest, what your governing documents say about how you should manage them, and that you are clear about how to approach conflicts properly in the best interest of your organisation. This includes actual, potential, and perceived conflicts. It's important not to underestimate the potential impact of a perceived conflict. If a stakeholder or beneficiaries or third parties might think that you have a conflict and that has impacted your decision making, that can seriously undermine the integrity of your decisions. So thinking about perceived conflicts is just as important. We do find that having policies can really help. Lots of charities will have wording provisions in their governing documents about conflicts and how they should be managed, but often the language is relatively impenetrable and a little legalistic. If you have a look at the Charity Commission model documents, you will get a sense of what I mean here. Many trustees in our experience find it more helpful to have a plain English policy that talks about conflicts in the context of your charity and sets out clear steps on what needs to be done to manage them. Conflict of interest registers are also useful, and they provide a great way to demonstrate that you are complying with your duties on conflicts. And a top tip from me in terms of practical management is to add conflicts as a standing agenda item at the beginning of every board meeting as a prompt for trustees to consider and declare if they feel they have any conflicts in connection with any of the matters to be discussed at that meeting. So the next pillar is on decision-making, risk and control. And in a moment, I'm going to hand over to Nick to talk to you about financial management. But just before I do that, I just want to touch on a little bit on decision-making and delegation. Now, decision-making is key, and we've already talked about the importance of managing conflicts to maintain the integrity of your decisions. But what you see on the slide here are some other key steps for decision-making. The Charity Commission does have an excellent guide on decision making called It's Your Decision. If you haven't read that, I would recommend it. It's not a lengthy document and it is really, really useful. This is clearly a more important process for more significant decisions, so decisions that might have a significant financial, reputational, or strategic impact on the charity. But broadly speaking, what you're aiming to do with decision making is to demonstrate that you have taken a decision that is within the range of reasonable decisions that a body of trustees could make in the circumstances. Critically, it doesn't matter if a different group of people would have reached a different decision. What matters is that you can demonstrate the reasonableness of your decision. And clearly, in order to do that, you need to make sure that you are working through the process. So is the decision in the best interest of the charity, and can that be clearly demonstrated? This ties back to your organisational purposes. Are you sufficiently informed? Have you got all of the necessary information to make that decision? Have you taken into account all relevant factors and disregarded anything irrelevant? Are you acting within your powers? Check your constitutional documents or take advice if you're not sure. And have you appropriately managed any conflicts of interest? If all of these steps have been taken and you have reached a decision that can be demonstrated as objectively reasonable, then it is very unlikely that your decisions would ever be unpicked. The Charity Commission is not in the business of replacing its subjective views in place of your own. What the Commission does when it looks into decision making is it assesses the process. The Commission wants to be clear that your decision is reasonable, and they will look for evidence to support that. So proper board minutes, board papers, and evidence of a decision-making process is really important, particularly for significant decisions. In terms of delegation, again, this is a decision, and the same decision-making process should apply. So deciding what to delegate will vary very much depending on the activities of your charity. What do we delegate? What are the limits of that authority? Job descriptions and terms of reference are extremely useful in being clear about the levels of authority and the roles that are being delegated by the board. But equally important is monitoring and reporting. And I just wanted to mention the Kids Company case from earlier this year, which some of you may be aware of. Some of you might have even read our articles on that when it happened earlier in February, March time. In that case, one of the key things being considered was whether the chief executive of Kids Company was a de facto director of the charitable company. And what the judge looked at in reaching her decision was the sort of decisions that were being taken by the chief executive, the level of authority, but critically, whether or not those decisions were subject to supervision and oversight. And in that case, notwithstanding that the chief executive was delegated a huge amount of authority, given her expertise and her role within the organisation, there was clear evidence that the trustees did manage and exercise appropriate oversight of the chief executive and her role. And in that way, the delegation was appropriate and the chief executive was found not to be a de facto director, so was not found to be a charity trustee herself. So delegation is important, but it is key to think about all of those steps when you're putting delegation procedures in place. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Nick, who's going to talk to you for about 15 minutes on risk management, particularly in a financial context.
Thank you.
Great.
Lovely. So as Liz says, I've got a short time. I'm going to cover a lot of ground. I've included quite a bit of detail on the slides, which I won't have time to take you through, but I really hope that this detail will be helpful for you later. Now, I'm an investment manager, so what I understand best from a practical point of view is the process about how a board would go through establishing a risk register and a reserves policy, which in turn could lead to the identification of medium and long-term reserves, and therefore a decision to approach an investment firm like Tilney Smith Williamson for advice. So the first step is to identify the risks in your organization. Most risks ultimately have a financial impact, and essentially your activities give rise to risk. So you're fulfilling your charitable purposes, looking after your beneficiaries, managing staff, your properties, your data, and of course those financial risks such as income sources, payments, bad debts, controls. From a top-down point of view, ask what are the worst things that could happen to your organization and try to quantify the impact using stress tests and scenario analysis. From a bottom-up point of view, look at what's gone wrong before. Look at your KPIs, your key performance indicators, and look at the robustness of your processes and controls. Plot these on your risk dashboard to help the board visualize risk impact and probability. And there's an example of this on a later slide, but also the Charity Commission also provides good guidance. Use scenario analysis workshops for your key teams to try and quantify the impact of different events. By plotting key risks on a heat map, and this one we show the potential costs of key risks on the y-axis and the probability of the risk occurring on the x-axis. You then design the key performance indicators to monitor and control those risks, and you can find that these add a great deal of value to long-term planning and trend analysis. It's worth spending time thinking about the new and emerging risks too. For example, the risk of a pandemic has been on our emerging risk register for over 5 years. One of the ways we help charities plan is to use scenario modeling software. In this example, we have a small charity with around £670,000 worth of funds, £105,000 of annual donations, presently planning to spend £110,000 per annum for the next 5 years, increasing thereafter to £120,000. Now, the trustee's goal was to spend all the assets over 35 years, and we helped them work out a realistic investment return target of CPI, so Consumer Price Index inflation, plus 3% after all costs. So looking at their current plans on the first scenario, the cash flow modelling showed that there was actually £1 million after 35 years and £1.3 million after 50 years. So actually, to meet the trustees' target to spend all the assets over 35 years, the trustees found that they can actually spend an extra £12,500 per annum. Now, my colleagues can run much more complex scenarios based on lots of different reserves pots and different projects and things like that. And there's nothing to stop you doing this yourself on Microsoft Excel. But our software does make the process faster and easier, and we can often put in different scenarios for trustees during a meeting so that they can visualize the impact of different potential decisions as they go. Now, the risk register, combined with stress tests and cash flow scenarios, can help trustees build their reserves policy. So what we show here is, what are the reserves? Well, you'll need a working capital requirement. That's to smooth out the inflow of income and capital. You'll need a reserve for risk management to meet unexpected expenditure. You'll need something that takes into account the unreliability of some of your income sources. And you'll also need to take into account what you might need to fund future commitments. Now, the risk register, the scenario analysis, will help you establish what your long and short-term reserves are, and possibly even some medium-term reserves. And it will also help you focus on what your risk capacity is. So that's, how much risk you can take. If you're looking after very vulnerable individuals, for example, you probably got less risk capacity than a charity looking after sort of arts foundations and things like that. And then, of course, your risk tolerance is the risk that you, the trustees, as a body, feel appropriate for an organisation of your type. And then you can decide how you actually organise those reserves. And those long-term reserves probably are typically those amounts that are unlikely to be drawn in the next 5 years. And they can be invested in stock markets to generate extra sources of revenue and protect the purchasing power of the capital from the impact of inflation. So once you've established that you have some funds available to build a long-term investment reserve, you then have to establish your investment policy. This is both best practice and required under the Trustee Act 2000. The investment policy is like a roadmap for the trustees and your investment manager to follow. We suggest that the investment policy is drawn up under the following headings: objectives and investment powers, time horizon and risk, portfolio constraints and restrictions. You might have some ethical constraints, for example. And then you agree with your investment manager what the strategic asset allocation is. That's the mix between different types of assets, fixed interest, equities, property, etc. And then benchmarks by which you will monitor performance and reporting. And then under performance and reporting, you would then look at how regular you would meet, what you would discuss, what information you need. Now, we would work with each charity to help them build up their policy, and we can provide quite detailed notes on the sorts of things that can be considered in each section. However, ultimate responsibility for the investment policy rests with the board. On the right-hand point of this slide, we provide a brief checklist. And I'd say that the most important points on this checklist is it's well worth appointing a subcommittee to advise the full board of trustees. You'll make much faster progress. It's really important to make sure that, as Liz has been saying, that all decisions are documented, particularly because trustees retire and new trustees are appointed, and they'll need to understand the original thought processes that established your investment policy. I'd also advise that you should keep your investment policy short and relevant. 20 to 30 page investment policies are not regularly, and they're not used the way that they should be. And then the final point is that it's well worth keeping them reviewed regularly, and I would advise annually. So in summary, the keys to good financial risk management are: make sure that you have a good budget process and good financial controls, build a robust risk register and monitoring process, use stress testing and scenario analysis to build a suitable reserves policy, construct a carefully thought through investment policy, and regularly monitor and review all of the above at board level. And I'm now going to pass you back to Liz, who will be able to take you through the next sections.
Thanks, Nick. Sorry for the slight delay there. Okay, so we're now going to go through the final 3 pillars of the Code of Governance that just finishes that midsection in the diagram that I showed you at the beginning. So the next pillar is board effectiveness, and I mentioned this earlier when we were looking at leadership. Part of the leadership pillar, and a key part of making sure that you're complying with that principle, is having an effective board, making sure your charity is led by an effective board. So what do we mean by that? What is board effectiveness? Well, this is about you operating as an effective team with the right balance of skills, experience, and background. So in practice, what you need to be thinking about here is, sorry, I moved on to the wrong slide. What you need to be thinking about here is your board composition, is thinking about whether you have people on the board who have the right skills, experience, and knowledge for your particular charity and the objectives that you have, your overarching organisational purpose. The skills and experience that you need will vary. The sector is incredibly diverse, and what matters is the skills and experience suitable to achieve your goals. Top practical tips in achieving this include, if you don't already have them, considering introducing terms of office or retirement by rotation. This is a natural way to try to create a refreshing of the board at irregular intervals. That's not to say that some individuals might not be so valuable to the charity that you want them to stay on for a longer period. But having that regular point at which terms of office end and you reconsider whether to reappoint that person, whether to appoint somebody new, it just is a helpful way of keeping the board fresh. The Commission recommends 3-year terms of office, and what you will see as standard in its model governing documents is also a provision saying that after 3 terms, so a total of 9 consecutive years, unless there are very good reasons to keep somebody on, it's generally recommended that trustees then retire at that point. Now, that might not work for every charity, but it is something to consider, and it is a good way of ensuring that your board doesn't become stale and too stuck with the same group of people operating it for a very prolonged period of time. Another top tip from a practical perspective is a skills audit. Some of you might already employ these within your organisations. They're really fantastic. What you do is you put together all of the skills and experience that you need for your particular organisation, taking into account the strategic plan for your charity, what your objectives are, what your values and mission and what sort of environment you want to achieve within the charity. You put all of those skills and experience down, and you ask your existing trustees to mark off those that they think they bring to the table. And in doing this, in collating all of that information, it helps you to identify where there might be any gaps that need to be plugged. Where you do identify gaps in skills and experience, we're then looking at the recruitment process. To be operating to the highest standards of governance, your recruitment process should be transparent and robust. And one top tip I would say is to make sure that you do take the time to ensure that incoming trustees understand the expectations of them, are committed to the charities, that all of those foundation principles that we talked about earlier are there, and that they understand the culture and the values and are supportive of those in coming into the board. What you don't want is to have an individual join the board who is going to try to take things in a very different direction, perhaps not in the best interest of the charity, perhaps pursuing personal agenda, or perhaps acting in a position of conflict. So just take care to make sure that the people you are bringing on are going to contribute positively to the board. One way to help with this is to have a series of meetings at which potential prospective trustees come and sit as observers, to carry out an induction process or pre-induction process, to provide information and answer lots of questions to make sure that trustees understand the role. Some charities also employ a job description for trustees, which is fine. It's not, that doesn't suggest an employment status, it's a sort of a trustee role description, which just helps to set out the expectations of the trustees on your board. So overseeing appointments should be rigorous, and then also developing the board. So even once people are on the board and have been on the board for a long time, even for those individuals who are quite experienced as trustees, there will always be areas for further development. And you ought to take the time to think about how you can further develop the board with training and with information that will help them to achieve their role in the best interests of the charity. Critically as well, it is about working as a team, collective decision making. We talked about this in the leadership and in the decision making pillars. The role of the chair here is quite crucial. What is important is that you ensure that you are creating and facilitating an environment in which all trustees feel able to constructively criticise, to share opposing views, and to have robust discussions, particularly on more important strategic decisions. A diversity of views at board level is really helpful in achieving a good and well thought through decision for the charity and in the best interest of the charity. And this brings us on neatly to the next pillar, which is the pillar on equality, diversity, and inclusion. And I mentioned earlier, this is another one of the pillars that was overhauled in 2020. It was previously just known as the diversity principle. Now, the changes this time are about recognizing that equality, diversity, and inclusion is a journey that should be pursued in your charity's context. It's important that you are alive to the issues. They are very, very relevant in today's society, and all charities need to be mindful of them, not only at board level, but all the way through the organisation. And key to achieving this pillar and achieving the principle of equality, diversity, and inclusion in your charity is leading by example. What you need to do is assess and your understanding of the systems and the culture within your organisation. Again, this is sort of a strategic, almost audit of what you've got going on. So what are your current processes and procedures? Are there any unconscious bias aspects in any of your procedures that could be changed? Have you identified any lack of understanding? Are there things that you can do to make a difference? Then it's about setting context-specific and realistic plans and targets. So how can you integrate equality, diversity, and inclusion into your organisation? Making sure that this is from the board level right the way down. Taking action, being proactive about this and monitoring performance, welcoming diversity of views and welcoming that very inclusive approach in your decision making, which is then very visible and transparent throughout the organisation and externally. So publishing your performance, publishing what you are trying to achieve and your progress against those goals can be a really great way of demonstrating your commitment to embedding principles of equality, diversity, and inclusion within your organisation. And this links to the final pillar, which is a pillar around openness and accountability. Now, in order to be acting in accordance with the highest standards of best practice and governance on openness and accountability, we need to think beyond simply the regulatory requirements. So I'm not just talking about annual returns to the Charity Commission or your annual report and accounts and that sort of accountability. I'm talking much more broadly than that. It's about transparency in everything that you do and being as open as possible unless there are good reasons not to be. Key to this is feedback and engagement. You should be engaging with stakeholders, with members, with beneficiaries, with employees, with anybody who has an interest in the charity, and listening to feedback. And again, this ties back to the leadership pillar. We talked about listening to feedback there. One top tip I would give here is to make sure that you are creating a culture in which everybody, volunteers, staff, beneficiaries, stakeholders, all feel comfortable to raise issues with you before they take them somewhere else. What you want is to know if there are any complaints, any concerns, any issues within the organisation first. You want people to come to you with that information without fear of being victimised for raising their head above the parapet and making noise about something that they've seen or that they think is a concern. So having appropriate complaints policies in place for staff, and that's sort of around your whistleblowing policies, for volunteers and for third parties, and making sure that you are open and transparent about the process and how you handle those complaints and issues when they arise. This is far preferable to seeing news about your charity in the headlines, or the first you hear of it being a letter from the Charity Commission coming across your desk, or these days into your inbox, with a number of questions and concerns from a regulatory perspective. So complaints handling is really critical to the engagement process, but all of the other principles, and in particular the equality, diversity and inclusion principle, and that operation of your charity with that inclusive nature will help you to head off the risk of complaints and issues arising. Having a process of engagement and listening to the people who have got a stake and an interest in the charity is really helpful. So those are some of the key things that I would say to take into account for openness and accountability. And a really top practical tip is making sure that you do put appropriate complaints handling procedures in place. So that's everything that we have time for today. We've got about 15 minutes now for questions, if anybody would like to raise any. And I'm just going to welcome Nick back to join me. So please do pop your questions into the question box if you have any. And we'd be very delighted to answer any questions that you have on anything that we've talked about today. Okay, so I have a question about examples of how to be transparent within a charity. And I think probably there's some very good real life examples if you have a look at other charities and what they've done. One good example that springs to mind is, some of you might have heard Amnesty International had a number of concerns raised about staff welfare following some suicides, very sadly, suicides of some of its employees. And what they did to address that is they engaged an external, independent investigation into the culture and the procedures within the charity. And they made a commitment to publish that report, warts and all. And so they were very, very transparent about the issues that were flagged, and then very transparent and open about how they then went on to handle them and make changes. And I think a key message here is that nobody is expecting your charity to be perfect. And it is, of course, impossible to protect against all risks. But what matters, and what the Commission's interested in when it does investigate issues, is that you have thought about and put appropriate policies and procedures in place, and that you're able to demonstrate that there's this constant striving to improve and raise the standards of governance within your organisation. What I would say, though, is don't try to tackle everything at once. Do take it in bite-sized chunks and make use of the code as a tool for continuous development and improvement within your organisation. Okay, I think there's a question here for Nick. So somebody's asking, Nick, that you said trustees are required to have an investment policy, and is that the case for all charities?
So that's if you're investing your reserves in markets. If you're delegating the investment of your reserves to a third party, then the Trustee Act 2000 requires trustees to have an investment policy. Now, not all charities have trustees. They have, some of them have directors and things, but I think that the Charity Commission guidance CC14 is very clear that if you don't have an investment policy and you're investing in the stock markets, then you're not following best practice. So if you want to protect yourselves, you definitely want to make sure you've got an investment policy.
Thanks, Nick. So I have a question that's really common, and actually we have seen a real increase in this sort of area. So somebody has asked, if a member of the board is not performing, can they be terminated? Now, it probably comes as no surprise that we've seen in our practice an increase in internal disputes amongst trustees, given all of the stresses and strains of the last 18 months. We have unfortunately seen a bit of an increase here. The answer to the question is not entirely straightforward. It will depend on what your governing documents say. It depends also on your legal form. So it is possible sometimes to remove a trustee, but it is not a straightforward process, and it shouldn't be your go-to. The starting point and what's expected from a good governance point of view is to seek to resolve the dispute, resolve the issues. And actually, if you've got somebody who's not performing, it's performance management that initially that you should be looking at there. It's trying to engage with that trustee to find out what the issues are and see if you can resolve them. Of course, sometimes that doesn't work, and sometimes you do end up in a position where you do need to consider parting ways. And we would always recommend trying to reach an amicable resolution, so inviting a trustee to resign rather than trying to take formal action to remove them is far preferable if they really are not operating or performing appropriately, or for example, if they are now in a position of situational conflict, which really makes their position no longer tenable. So there is no quick answer. It is sometimes possible to remove a trustee, but it's not an easy process. It does require careful thought and advice, and there are risks associated with it. So we would recommend that you do everything you can to resolve things amicably before you take those sorts of steps. Okay. Nick, a question for you. For a small startup charity, how much do you expect they should budget to ensure all of this is in place? Well, I don't know if that's specifically for Nick or maybe for both of us in terms of, how much to spend on governance. And again, I think the answer is probably there's no one size fits all answer to this, and you might not need a significant budget because a lot of this is just about making changes in your organisation. And if you depends on how small you are, you might have staff who you can delegate some actions to. So if you want to have a review and an overhaul of a particular policy, you can perhaps delegate that to your executive if you have one. If you're a very small charity that doesn't have any employees, then that's the sort of thing that the trustees can take on for themselves, or you could engage consultants externally. But it's very difficult to give you a one-size-fits-all answer as to how much to budget, because it really does depend on the identified needs within your organisation and how much you can deal with internally.
Yes, I think I'd just add, I mean, if on the investment side, you probably don't need to spend a huge amount of money as long as the trustees are kind of intelligent and engaged, and you can usually get investment managers to do quite a lot of the legwork for you and guidance. You really, if they're not giving you quite a lot of hand holding, then that's quite unusual.
There is another question here for you, Nick. Somebody's asked, I think, a follow-up question to your previous answer about whether you need an investment policy, asking whether that would apply to investment in bank savings, i.e. a high interest long deposit account, whether that would require an investment policy.
I think cash at bank, probably not. But if you, as you will be aware, that banks don't really pay any interest anymore. If you start locking cash up for long periods of time with banks, obviously that needs to be documented. The reasons behind that need to be documented to make sure that the board are protected from a decision. And if you start taking credit risks, so really going down to lower quality institutions in order to get some sort of return on your cash, again, that you would want to make sure that that was properly documented. Probably doesn't need a full investment policy, but you would want to make sure that that was clearly considered and thought about by the board.
I mean, that comes back to what we were talking about with decision making. It really is everything that you do should be properly documented in board minutes. And the more significant a decision, the more important that audit trail becomes.
It is the only way to protect yourselves.
Hmm.
Yes.
So another question here. Do we have any advice on schemes of delegation regarding decision making and the levels of authority within the charity? Well, again, this is one where there isn't a one size fits all answer. If you took some of the largest household name or internationally operating charities, which are enormous and have a huge turnover and loads of employees, as you would expect, quite a lot gets delegated into the organisation, and it's a very, very high level strategic role that the trustees then play. And I think what then becomes more important is about the values and the organisational direction, and that very strategic role in setting the values and creating the culture within the charity for success. Of course, all the way through an organisation of that size, you would still expect to see clear levels of authority at each level, but the board wouldn't necessarily be involved, and I wouldn't expect it to be involved in every aspect of delegation. So the board would be responsible for the delegation to that senior executive team, and they would then be responsible for delegation down and so on. So really at board level, what you're thinking about there is what is your senior executive team going to be responsible for, and what do you want to have reported back to you, and where are those levels of authority set at a limit. For smaller charities with a small staff or perhaps no employees that operate with a volunteer group, then you would expect significantly less to be delegated and much more of the decision making to happen within the charity. Taking the most extreme example, if you look at a grant making charity, you would expect very little, in fact, to be delegated anywhere, perhaps only administration, so collating of grant applications, sending out letters, that sort of thing. You might engage an administrator to do that, but all of the decision making about who to make grants to, the investment policy, the investment of the funds of the charity, those would all be taken by the trustees with support from professional advisors as appropriate. So it really does vary. It's such a diverse sector. It's incredibly difficult to give you an answer that is going to suit all charities. And I think that's why the principles of the code are drafted in the way that they are, without giving you any hard and fast rules, but giving you the sorts of tools that you need to assess what's appropriate for your organisation. Nick, there's a question here on cybersecurity, which I think might be one that you might be able to talk to a little. What level of risk should be considered in the context of cybersecurity? Now, I appreciate neither Nick nor I are cybersecurity experts, but I imagine that this is a hot topic for many of your clients, Nick, on that cybersecurity risk, and actually for your organisation also. It certainly is for ours.
I mean, it's probably the most frightening risk that we all face, because it's, you know, you just don't know whether your systems are good enough or not until they've been tested and proven. And yeah, you're absolutely right. We all spend a huge amount of time training our staff. I mean, putting the right levels of security in the first place, and then making sure that staff are really well trained and kept up to date to make sure that they don't open things that are, you know, that they really shouldn't be opening. And it's, you know, understanding, you know, what a phishing email looks like. I mean, I think we all face them every day in our inbox, and you know, and obviously if you lose the data, then reputational risk is enormous. And if
Absolutely.
you lose your beneficiary data or your you know, that's kind of incalculable. So yeah, it's a huge risk. How do you quantify it on your systems and things like that? Yeah, it's a you know, it's not just the loss of data and the reporting it and the possible fines you might get if you've proven not to be looked after the data very well, but also it's the kind of, how do you deal with the reputational fallout and that sort of thing. And you definitely need to have a plan in place now to deal with that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, you may have seen the news that the charity Mermaids was fined recently for a data breach by the ICO. So, you know, charities, we're seeing these things happening, and charities are not exempt at all from these rules and these requirements. So it is important to be alive to it. And there are lots of different methods that you can employ to protect your charity against that risk of cyber threat. And again, it will very much depend on the nature of your organisation as to how much to spend and what measures are most appropriate to put in place. I think a lot of people are looking to technological solutions and providers of cybersecurity for your charity. But then there are also the really key human error training points that Nick's mentioned. I think those are really significant risks within any organisation.
I mean, we saw the NHS struggle because it hadn't been updating the software. You know, we're using Microsoft software, but do you actually need to keep it up to date? Otherwise, it doesn't work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've probably got time for one more, and this is hopefully a short one. It's somebody making the point that actually the idea of a reserve big enough to enable you to exist in the event of a loss of a significant fund for a certain number of months, you know, that's important, but how realistic is it to be able to address this in, you know, a short period, so 3 or 6 months? So the question is, would it be appropriate to aim for 12 months on this? And I think just from my own I'm a trustee of a charity, and you know, we needed to rebuild and build up our reserves after a period of difficulty. And yes, it does take time, and having a reserves policy with a level that you're aiming for, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be there immediately, but it's about having thought that through and then be putting, you know, strategy in place to get there. I mean, Nick, would you add anything to that?
We do a survey of charity clients every couple of years, and in 2018 we were surprised by, I think 40% of the charities that we surveyed had less than 6 months reserves. And then we've just finished a survey now, and actually that number has dropped to 20%. I mean, we thought that was too low, and actually the number of charities that now have a reserve over 12 months is about 40%. So it's split. It's moved completely to longer term reserves, because, you know, nobody could anticipate just how damaging the pandemic would be.
Absolutely. Okay, I think that's all we've got time for today, but thank you ever so much for attending, and we hope you found it useful and interesting and helpful to your organisation. You will all receive a copy of the slides, and the webinar will be available on the Birketts YouTube channel if you would like to go back over any part of it more slowly or in a bit more detail. Thanks again for attending. Take care.
Thank you.